I've always been very, very interested in classical music when I was very young, but in a very informal way. But then after that, when I started to be interested in pop music, I was more into rock bands and all that. And I was brought up in an era where rock was theatrical. You know, it was the great years of Gentle Giant, Jethro Tull, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Genesis, and all these bands. So for me, my interest in theater came from the music, actually, because the music that I became interested in and addicted to was a music that was very theatrical in the sense that it had characters, it was telling stories. It was in the days where LPs had all these small little songs on one side, had a big, long concept song on the other side. So I guess that's pretty much what really stayed with me in the early years of my youth. It was all this theatrical rock music. There's something about the theater that's still to be devised or invented or something like that. It sounded like when I did my early classical guitar courses when I was in high school and all that, it was too much discipline. It was way too much. It meant practicing a lot. And in those days, theater was a lot about improvising and being who you are and saying what you want to say on the moment. So it's only later on that I got interested in text and in disciplined forms of theater. But before that, I think that's pretty much the thing that turned me off from becoming a musician. Even though I loved playing music and I love hanging out with musicians, but I don't know, it meant really practicing. And either that was a bit of a burden for me, or it just wasn't accessible to my class in the sense that I was brought up in a family in a small apartment. You can't really have even my classical guitar, you know, you couldn't really practice at night and do anything, you know, there's too many people in the house. I mean, I guess you have to have some, you have to have your own space if you want to become a musician. And I think also that I'm more of a visual person, less of a sensitive auditive person. So I react to music in a very visual way, and I think that if you want to be a good musician or composer, you have to interiorize, I think, sound and harmony and all that, which was not my thing necessarily at that time. Well, let's say that in the early days of theatrical creation that I participated to, sound wasn't present as much as it became. Sound, I mean, sound effects or soundscapes and all that. That came into my work with somebody called Bernard Bonnier, who one day, we had hired him as a musician to accompany the show, but discovered that what he was producing was not just music, it was also sound and soundscape, and we were producing sounds and music in a certain way just by using the early vocoders and speaking into them and all that. So that pretty much kind of changed my my approach on music, in the sense that the person who would accompany the show musically would also be a sound person, not just a musician or a composer. And for me, the line between the two is always very, very vague and very, it's very unclear sometimes on certain projects. Well, you know, is this music or is this sound or is it noise or is it and I like that thing to be blurred. It kind of pushes the envelope. And so for a long time, I was accompanied by a musician who would play music, but from a certain point, I was more interested in having people playing with the sound of my own voice, creating soundscapes or musical landscapes that would be more three-dimensional in a certain way, that would be not just there as a decor, not just there as a scenery. People pretty much use music in the theater as a wallpaper sometimes, and I always think, well, yeah, music can be there as a background, but it has this thing to say. And because I write my own stuff, the rhythm of what I write and the relationship and of the dialogue and with the action and all that always has to be in relationship with the sound, and that eventually creates a kind of a score. So at times it's more musical, at times it's more sound effect. But for me, the line between music and sounds or noise is very blurred, and unless you want to refer to a very specific source music, you say, okay, well, this guy played this song and it's specifically that. But in general, I like to keep it vague. What I'd say, what really kind of shifted my opinion and interest in music in my work is when I started to do opera. And I've been trying naively in a very clumsy way in my theater work after that to try to attain the same goal as opera attains with music. The thing about opera is that the music is there to give the subtext. Very often you're creating a scene with some singers, and the answers to your questions, or the answer to, let's say we're looking how to stage this, the answer is often not in the text, it's in the music. If you listen carefully, good operas, I mean, of course, this is a good work, usually gives you all the answers. And that's the thing that kind of surprised me when I started to work in the opera, is that instead of sitting around a table and having people read a text and we kind of all assume what this means and we try to understand what the writer's intentions were and we all argue and we all have our different theories, in opera, people just sing the score and all the answers are in the score. And that, I think, is for me, kind of shifted my perspective at one point. I said, well, how can we do that in the theater? How can we... the answers are not always in the text. They're not always in the staging or the gesturing or in the choreography. Sometimes the answer is in the music or in the soundscape. So I'm trying to create things where I'm trying to go more and more towards a musical theater. Musical theater is a big epithet that contains a lot of things, but I think that there is a way of making theater more musical without doing musicals or opera. I think that there's something about the delivery of the text that could be more musical, because theater tends to try to imitate film or realism, television realism. People are trying to be naturalistic on stage when actually it's not the place you should be naturalistic. You have to be truthful, you have to be real, you have to be believable, but you have to be theatrical. And the way to do that is to find ways to sing what it is that you're saying, or playing with the curve of the text and how music can interfere with that. And it's also true of the action. How do you accompany the action, and how does the music support that or indicate what is the action to do? So that's my interest. But of course, I don't have a name for it really. I call it musical theater, which is kind of an odd epithet. But if we speak visually, theater has evolved in a way where 2-3 centuries ago, people would not accept that we see things as well as we do now on the theater. Today, there's no excuse not to see things well, because things are better lit from all sides and there's more possibilities. So in general, you see the performers more, and you could play around with that. And I think it should be the same thing with sound and music, in the sense that the microphone, whether the microphone is a handheld microphone or it's disguised somewhere in somebody's back of the ear, it allows you to do things in acting, for example, that you can't do if you're just... And a lot of people are against that, because people are still seeing that as if they were 2 or 3 centuries ago. But actually, I do a lot of stuff speaking in phones, and so you could lower the voice, you could get subtleties in the interpretation and the acting, and do a lot of things that you're allowed to do in film, but you're not allowed to do on stage usually. So that's why I welcome these things, and they've always been very liberating for me. And they allow you to bring the audience within the place through a door that they don't go through a lot. And I still believe in the human voice and in its power and the theatrical voice. I still believe in that, but I have the impression that we have to be open to all the new tools, the same way that people are open to innovation and lights and video or projectors. I think that music in the theater is always an active participant. In film, it's there to make you forget that cuts don't work. I mean, that's what the main function of sound in a movie is, to make things that don't go together. So it's the peanut butter that you put that's all spread and all that. And of course, there are some amazing soundscape artists and sound editors and all that in film who actually know how to use it and how to make it be the soul of film. But for example, what's Dunkirk? Dunkirk's the soundtrack of that is amazing, and it's more eloquent than the actual dialogue, which is very sparse in the movie when it's used that way. But in general, sound is used to kind of sandwich thing, and try to make everything feel as if it's all happening at the same time on the same day, shot on the same day with the same light, with the same. But in theater, it's a different thing. Sound and music are dynamic statements. They're a choice, and it's a way of writing the story. It's part of the storytelling, and so I've always felt that I was more clumsy when I was doing film. I couldn't understand how to do that with film, but in theater I could understand how to do it. I think that in good big rock bands or musical artists today who play in big stadiums and things like that, what he sings about, whoever, whether it's Bono and U2 or Peter Gabriel, whom I've worked with, or whoever, you fill an audience of a stadium of 20,000, 30, sometimes 60,000 people. So what it is that you're going to sing about has to be larger than life. And that's the thing with opera, is that opera, you can't sing about petty things. The sound is too loud. Everything is over the top. Everything's larger than life. So you could only sing about important things, universal things. And I remember when I did the first tour with Peter Gabriel, at times we would play in small venues, and at times we'd play in very, very large venues, stadiums and things like that. And people did not relate to the material the same way. So sometimes the song list would change, and I would say to Peter, well, I don't think we could do this song. It's just not going to fly. People have, your mental age is much lower when you're in a big crowd than when you're in a small crowd. So for me, that was an interesting experience to understand that. And I remember an evening in Munich at the Olympic Stadium in Munich. We're doing Peter's secret world tour, and it was in the early days of in-ear monitoring. So people were just kind of hopping around on stage and singing a song. I don't remember what the song was and all that. And Peter was singing and all that. And the PA crashed, except guys were still hearing in their monitors and their ears. They could hear each other sing. So they kept playing, but of course what the audience would hear is just the drum, basically like a cheap sound of a drum or something like that. And Peter's voice. Because he was at that level. You could see that in this room, with this kind of sound, even if he didn't have any amplification, he was that big. He was filled with the energy of that room, and he was singing about big things, and it was a big sound coming out of his mouth, even though the mic just got, of course, it made a shift. And then everybody kind of realized, that something was wrong, and wait a minute, and then we had to postpone for 5 minutes, and then things came back. But there's something about the sound you produce in a big room and in a small room, and who you're speaking to, if it's a big crowd or a small crowd, it really has a lot to do with your mental age changing, shrinking and becoming very sophisticated if you're in a small 600-seater. So you could, the music reaches you in a very, very different way. Well, there's something that struck me one day. I was in an interview in Toronto at the CBC, the English CBC. I was being interviewed. And after the interview, I remember asking the person, "My God, you're good. You're a very good interviewer and all of that. Weren't you ever interested to do this on TV?" And the person said, no, because radio is much more visual. It's an amazing, it's the most visual of mediums. And it kind of struck me that, it does get into your head. Radio really gets into your head. It plants images in your head. It's a very, very, very imagistic visual medium, come to think of it. And that, for me, was important realization, because I thought, well, maybe we don't need to always show and always have to go through the image door. At times, sound does it, and does it better. And so for me, that was an important thing. As for the new technologies and the new, you have to invite anything that's on the market, you have to invite it into the realm of your work, even though if at the end you don't really use everything. But every technological advancement or tool or toy that's available, it's like coming into a painter's workshop and bringing a new medium, a new paint. And I think it's important. A lot of people kind of are afraid of that. New technology, they're afraid of technologies. They're afraid that it's going to take over, eclipse, obscure the message. And I would say, well, that's because the people who don't know how to use it, or people who are ill-advised when they use it. I always give the example that, when the 19th century, at the height of the Grand Masters, the people who painted all these amazing portraits and painters would have to have money to do these paintings. They have to be commissioned by some rich commissioner or patron, because oil on canvas was a very expensive thing. All that. Suddenly, this really cheap version of paint is invented. It's called acrylic in the last third of the 19th century, and suddenly the layman, who has an amazing talent but who could never express anything, suddenly has access to something that's really cheap and can paint, can do all these things. The only problem with acrylic is that it dries very quickly. So you only have time to do an impression. And that's the creation of Impressionism. And it's a huge artistic movement that completely shapes the way people see things and the way people express things. So that's why I would say there's always some cheap new thing or fad or gadget that's there, that if you play around with it and see how it could help you tell your story, it might even change the way you do theater or the way you tell stories. So we have to be open-minded to these things, but of course we have to know how to use them. Many of them. I think that in the earlier days, with Bernard Bonnier, when we were doing Circulation, it became a complete symphony. That wasn't the intention at the start, but the way and the playfulness of how we used sound and the way we used music and the way dialogue and music and all of that was all kind of blended together, and it was a very, very playful, creative thing. That was a big home. But I remember, then I did a lot of shows where we did a lot of interesting stuff, but I remember particularly working on things like, for example, Eyonagata, which was a dance piece with Sylvie Guillem and Russell Malafant, where suddenly there was very few words. It was a dance piece, so we still insisted to have some spoken scenes, but text suddenly was not playing the leading role anymore, like it usually does in my shows. In this case, it was more of a kind of a background or a little prologue or an explanation. So sound and music was holding the whole energy of the show and also telling the story. So that, for me, was a very, at times very sparse, but just really what you needed at that moment. And also the cultural references, is that there was a lot of kodo references, and there was kabuki instrumentation or no theater percussions or accents and things like that. And it's all the way that came with kind of a Japanese reference, but used in a very contemporary way. And there was a lot of reinvention, and also how swords would be mic'd to create thunder and things like that. So there was an interaction. And because we were also in a very bare space, because as comes with dance, there's always just a dance mat and a lot of lighting, very few props, very few, so compared to what I usually do, it's very bare. So the music became an object, became a concrete object. For me, that was a very well designed and very well integrated way of using sound and music in a performance. Not for nostalgic reasons, but more because I like going back to that period. The progressive rock era with a lot of Gentle Giant stuff. So of course, you know, the Octopus was an amazing revolution and revelation for me. So that's for sure. I'd want to refer to that. I did discover doing opera, the world of Wagner. So for sure, I certainly would want to bring. Of course, if you don't have just a few albums, you want to have 16-hour-long concepts. So of course, The Ring was a big thing for me because I was very reluctant at first. But it's this extraordinary thing that you keep digging into the music and digging and see how it's incredibly organic and well done, and the leitmotifs and all that. It's just an incredible work of art. And I certainly would want to have something more from something with soul, you know, because I'm a great fan of The Weeknd, because I think he kind of reconciles pop music with rap, with sounds and colors of the good rhythm and soul, rhythm and blues era. So there's something very, very modern, but at the same time that inherits the whole tradition of black music. People are less aware of the work of like Pierre Henry and people like that, who died recently, I think, who was the guru of so many other great soundscapers and whose music was, I think, so interesting because it wasn't just about music. It was used in a lot of contemporary dance at the time, and a lot of theater and even architecture. The world of Pierre-Henri and Xenakis and these guys in the mid-60s or late 60s paved the way to so much experimentation, and where so many different disciplines were invited into the realm of music. Suddenly music wasn't just for the music world. They created a type of electroacoustic research that invited the world of theater, the world of architecture, the world of opera or other types of music that weren't usually invited. So Pierre-Henri was as interested by the relationship of two metal balls banging each other, and the kind of, for him, that was as much music and dynamic and tempo than a violin piece. So So suddenly it was very permissive, and it's I think the work of these guys in the, as I say, in the maybe mid or late '60s was seminal to so much interesting work after that. Well, I guess hip hop, good hip hop, but yeah, hip hop. I'm always surprised that when I'm in a car and you have access to Sirius or whatever is thing where now you could, you know, some people go because they like, people go for the 90s or the 70s, or there's always like some kind of decade that they go for. But I always look for the hip hop. For some reason, it's something that, and it's not something I would use on stage. It's not something that I don't go see hip hop artists. Not a fan necessarily of the hip hop, but it's this thing that when I'm in a car, it makes sense. It's people speaking, talking, telling a story at the same time. The grooves are interesting. There's always something musically and in the experiment also with the recording. Yeah. There's so many, and I always find that very interesting.